be great.
Yeah. All right, we are live, episode 201 of the In the Tank podcast. I'm your host, Donald Kendall, and joining me today, we have got a few different people on the interwebs. Who do we got first? We have got Justin Haskins, editorial director here at the Heartland Institute. Justin, what's your favorite movie?
That is a really tough question. I wasn't prepared for that. You didn't ask me what I honestly don't know. I mean, if you're talking about pure enjoyment, that's different than like what I think maybe the best movie is. Those are different things. I personally really, and this is like such a stupid conservative thing to say, but I really do enjoy The Patriot.
Okay, classic.
I really enjoy that movie.
Wow, racially charged answer.
I realize that, like, you know, I usually ask, like, how are you doing today? Nobody cares, but they might be interested in what your favorite movie is. Also joining us today, we have Isaac Orr, policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. Isaac, who would win in a fight in their prime, Sylvester Stallone or Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Stallone.
Not even close. Oh,
Stallone?
God, that's way off.
Oh, no way. Arnold was just all about the roids.
Yeah, that's why he'd win.
I don't think so, man. Like, the Green Bay Packers drafted Tony Mandrich instead of Barry Sanders, and once they found out he was on roids and had to stop, like, dude couldn't block his way out of a paper bag.
Yeah, but he didn't ask who would win the fight if they weren't taking PEDs. He
Well,
said
they're probably
who would
both
win
on
the fight.
PEDs.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, Stallone was Rambo, okay? Who's going to win, Rambo or the dad from Junior? It's going to be...
Arnold Schwarzenegger looks so unhuman that they cast him as a machine, like a killing machine.
No, I'm just saying that Rambo would beat Turbo Man.
Okay,
Byron, give me the Turbo Man, dog.
Nobody even knows who that is.
Jingle all the way.
Also with us, we've got producer extraordinaire Andy Singer over there, who does not have a mic or a camera yet, but that
or a personality.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he should get one of those first, shouldn't he?
He has no mic, so he can't defend himself.
So not joining us is Jim Lakely. He is at, or just finishing up, maybe he's heading home, I don't know, from ICCC 13, the International Conference on Climate Change 13, which we will talk about a little bit today. But if you weren't there or didn't see it live, you could pretty much see everything, right, Andy, on our YouTube page. Probably have a link to it on heartland.org if you are interested. We're also going to be talking about, if you haven't seen the title of the episode, Capitalism is Saving the Planet. And then, of course, we have to talk about Bernie Sanders and his, run-in with minimum wage and all of that towards the end.
Ooh.
But first, Jim got us a sponsor. So the Pleasant Valley Renaissance Fair. Are you longing for a time where you aren't burdened by the stresses of modern-day grind? Do you wish to set aside your concerns for paying a mortgage and instead focus your attention on saving the damsel in distress? Well, grab your hems, helmets, and jesters hats and head on down to the Pleasant Valley Renaissance Fair. No Game of Thrones cosplay allowed. All right, thanks, Jim, for getting us that.
Oh, wow, that's a good get.
Yeah, so check that out. Justin's just dying over there. All right, so let's just get on to it then.
That's awesome. I'm so glad we got our first sponsor.
All right, ICCC 13 just wrapped up, International Conference on Climate Change. Gentlemen, have you had the opportunity to check out some of this? I know the answer for Andy is yes, because his job yesterday basically was to live tweet about it and, find sections that he's going to clip out for shortened clips and videos and stuff like that, in case people only have a short attention span, don't want to watch the 12 hours that's there. But did anyone catch any aspects of that? I've got a little bit, but just give you two the opportunity first. Isaac, Justin?
Nope, didn't watch it.
Oh yeah, well, Justin, you had a good excuse. You were flying home.
I was in the air basically all day, flying from not the West Coast, but from Texas. So no, I haven't seen it yet. I do have to go back. There's a couple of different people that I wanna watch. In particular, Patrick Michaels.
Oh, that's who I would want to watch too.
I know. I stole that answer from Isaac. He said that's who he wanted to watch. I actually really like listening to and reading Patrick Michael. So I am looking forward to that presentation. The keynote address, of course, but there's a couple of keynote addresses. I want to check those out, but haven't had a chance to just yet. Probably will over the weekend.
Isaac, who do you said Patrick Michaels as well. First off, why? And secondly, anyone else?
Well, one of the unfortunate things is Cato decided to discontinue their Center for the Study of Science, and that's where Pat was at. So he was one of the thought leaders that I really looked for when it came to the climate change stuff. I really enjoyed his book, Luke Warming. So I'm really kind of sad that he doesn't have an outlet to inform me about the latest developments on what's just going on in the climate issue. So I do kind of supplement that with some Judith Curry stuff, but yeah, that's why. Plus he wears tennis shoes when he gives a talk, which is awesome.
All right. That's a good reason as any. Yeah, I did catch some of it here and there. I had a pretty busy day myself yesterday, but I made sure to check out Jay Lair's acceptance speech. He was awarded the 2019 Dauntless Purveyor of Climate Truth Award. And, like he had a lot of really good information that he kind of gave during this kind of acceptance speech. But one of the things that kind of stuck out to me was, he talked about his kind of history, I guess, with the EPA and how he kind of helped found it and stuff like that. And now, several decades later, he's working to roll it back. But one of the things that he kind of made clear in his acceptance speech is just basically his appreciation and love for the environment and stuff like that. Whereas, people would think that we hate the environment. We're we want to poison lakes and stuff like that. So, but yeah, it just kind of made me think about like the idea, and I think I've talked about this before on the podcast, that like, the left and the right, maybe the fringe groups of whatever side are an exception to this, but the left and the right generally want the same things. We want the same goals, I guess I should say. It's just the approach in achieving those goals is where we find our differences, right? So like better environment, better education, better lives in general, both sides want these things. It's just how do we achieve those things is what's different. So we disagree on the path to get there, but the one, I guess, difference, and maybe Isaac, you might be the one that kind of reality checks me on this, but I think the big difference between the two is that I think people on our side think the people on their side are just kind of maybe well-intentioned, but are being misled in the path that would best get to their end results. Whereas their side thinks that we're just evil. So I don't know. Do you have a response to that?
I don't know. I think our side isn't quite as charitable as that. Because I think most of those people are just clueless. So maybe they're well-intentioned, but they don't know anything. But I think a lot of them just have this belief that, what they're doing is good, what anyone else is doing is bad. So I agree with your statement to an extent, but I also think that a lot of the people on the left, like anti-mining people, anti-pipeline people, like those people are they're crooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I just like see like minimum wage or something like that, which we'll talk about a little bit more towards the end. And it's like, yeah, like that just seems to be the knee jerk. Like we want our workers to have more take home cash or something. Let's just raise minimum wage.
Right.
And then we go and like, all right, well, you're well intentioned, but if you do this, there's some unintended consequences. It's actually going to result in, outcomes that aren't beneficial to workers and stuff like that. So again, well intentioned, but they're just being misled on the actual path to get there. Whereas, like I seen the tweets from the Heartland Institute talking about, we just wrapped up ICC 13, and you see the response is just like, well, it was all lies. You're funded by big oil, all of this. So it's just, I don't know. That's just the example that I've seen most recently. Justin, you want to chime in before we actually get to our topic of discussion here?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree either. I think it depends on who you're talking about. So I think regular people walking down the street who happen to lean in the direction of the far left or whatever, I think they are well-intentioned, and I think they just don't necessarily know everything that's going on. They certainly don't know about all the environmental harms and stuff like that many of the renewable energy sources of, many renewable energy sources carry with it a lot of environmental harms. And I don't think a lot of people know that. And I know we're going to get into some of that stuff later. But do I think that the people who are in Washington, do I think politicians, do I think people who work at the EPA, do I think that a lot of those people are necessarily well-intentioned? No, not really. Right. I don't think they're well-intentioned, especially when it comes to climate issues, because as we've pointed out on this show many times, everybody who's involved in this debate knows. They all know that if you cut every single ounce of CO2 in the United States, you could cut it down to absolutely zero. We could have no CO2 emissions in the United States. Zero. No fossil fuels. Nothing. You get rid of all of that, and it still wouldn't stop climate change. And they, by their own, that makes all sorts of assumptions that that complies with what they've been saying for a long time, that comports with what they've been saying. So even if we assume that humans are the primary drivers of climate change, that CO2 is one of the primary drivers of climate change, even if we make all those assumptions, they know that cutting it down to zero is not, by their own estimates, going to get rid of climate change, yet they're running around telling everybody that it will. So I have to believe that they're lying there, that's not ignorance. They know that. I mean, they've seen those studies, they've seen those reports, all these politicians, they know this stuff. So do I think they're well-intentioned? No, I think that they know that it's not going to do anything, and they want to do it anyway because it helps them in other areas. Now, you could make the argument, I guess, that overall, do they think that, is it well-intentioned because maybe they're misleading people and lying to people and stuff like that, but they think that this is for the good of humanity at the end of the day? Yeah, you could make that argument. I think they think that if they were running every aspect of our lives, we'd all be better off. We're all just a bunch of stupid sheep. And if they were in charge of our lives, that we would all be better off. So yeah, in that sense, I guess they're well-intentioned, but if you're saying, are they just, ignorant people who think that they're calling for good policies and they think these policies will work, but they just don't realize the effects of them? No, I think they know that they won't work. They don't care that they won't work because their ultimate goal is not really to pass, renewable energy mandates that are somehow going to magically stop climate change from happening 80 years into the future. That's not their primary purpose. So in that sense, I don't think they're well-intentioned.
All right. Well, Andy, I think there is like polls on this. I am talking about kind of the general populace or whatever. So see if you could find a poll talking about this. If you do, just wave me down and I'll stop what we're talking about. But the main topic kind of ties into this that we want to talk about, and I teased this last episode, and it is a concept that coincidentally Isaac and Justin, and to a lesser extent we're all kind of talking about and thinking about and even writing about simultaneously without any kind of correspondence with each other. So I want to get into this, and it is the idea that capitalism is saving the planet. So what I have in front of me is 3 articles, and I think Isaac said there was either a 4th one on the way or it was just most recently published, all by Isaac Orr himself, posted at the Center of the American Experiment website, focusing in on capitalism is saving the planet. So let me play devil's advocate here, Isaac, and let you respond. So I would contend, as a, my socialist big government self here, putting on the devil's advocate hat, that capitalism is destroying the planet. Okay. The only way that we can repent from causing environmental degradation is to switch to from a capitalist system to a socialist system. So what do you have to say about that, man?
All right. So in order to do that, like, central planning requires rationing. So what is going to be the first thing that you are willing to give up? Right. Like,
obviously, I guess Lamborghinis and helicopter pads on the rich people's roofs.
Bernie Sanders is going to be the first one to go. But when you're looking at this, centrally planned economies have worse environments than the United States. So if you're looking for a place where you actually have a clean environment, they tend to be more capitalist, more upper income countries. And when you have a worse environment, it's more command and control. It's less capitalism. It's less respect for private property rights. And we've seen that in real world data throughout the universe.
Okay, so what are you trying to compare Venezuela to the United States? I mean, come on,
Again,
man.
yes.
These are can't make that connection. I mean, capitalism in the United States destroying the environment. Prove me wrong.
Venezuela used to be a pretty clean place, and then socialism happened. So even when you look back at Soviet Russia, right? So one of the pieces that I wrote in this series is called "In Soviet Russia, Air Pollutes You,"
Great title.
because I love those Russian reversal jokes. But when you look at the amount of output per unit of pollution, so GDP output per pollution, it was always lower in the United States because we had much more incentive to be efficient because markets drive efficiency. So if you have a bunch of waste, then that is just a lost opportunity for your costs, for your bottom line. So really, if you have competition, if you have all of these things that make economies work more efficiently, then you are going to incrementally reduce the amount of pollution.
All right, I'm not gonna take off the devil's advocate hat because
Sure.
it's too hot in here already.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but I do have a couple of other supplemental pieces talking specifically about socialism and their historically horrible track record when it comes to environmental costs and stuff like that. But I want to stick with your first piece for a minute. This one is just called "Wealth Makes Health Eventually."
Yep.
So explain to us the Kuznets curve. And Andy, pull this up.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution or having a wealthier society in the United States, there is absolutely a period of time where the environment was degraded. I mean, when you go back, I wish that was bigger. But as you see on the bottom, you've got per capita income, and then the y-axis is environmental degradation. So as your per capita income starts to increase, you do degrade the environment. But eventually you hit a point to where people become wealthy. And because of that, they begin to prioritize the environment again. So they say, look, we need to make sure that we are doing our economic development in a more environmentally responsible way. And then you start to see pollution decline. And that's where we are in the United States. And I would actually argue that we are on the far right end of that spectrum in terms of environmental degradation is low because per capita incomes are very high. So that's the theory behind this. And I think it holds up.
Yeah, I mean, you point out an example that in the 1980s. You want to go into that, or I have it in front of me. I could read it off.
Let's see here. Yes. So the EPA puts out this report every single year. It's called Our Nation's Air, and it's really interesting. And for the last few years, they've been putting out this graph that shows a comparison between the amount of pollution that is out in the atmosphere generated by people in the United States and the economy. So since 1980, our pollution has gone down 67%. So it's 67% lower today than it was in 1980. Yet our economy is 165 times larger. We have 44% more people. We use 25% more electricity. So not only have we reduced our absolute amount of pollution in the world or in the United States, but we've done so while increasing the amount of wealth that each of our citizens has.
Okay. But so Justin, I'll group you in here. You and I, probably everyone in this room, has a pretty skeptical mind. You're just like, all right, I hear one thing, but I need to read into this a little bit deeper. Does this seem to hold water to you?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to say that, you look at GDP growth and you see it's 165% since 1980. That's in the chart that Isaac's referencing, which is in that post on AmericanExperiment.org. But 165% for gross domestic product, an increase, but you also see emissions 67% for 6 common pollutants. That decreases over the same period. That makes sense. As Isaac pointed out, if people have more money to spend, if people are wealthier, they're going to start focusing on things that matter to them, but maybe not matter as much as, say, eating their next meal or having a house over, to live in and that kind of thing. So when you're not worried about crime, and you're not worried about having a house, and you're not worried about starving to death, and you're not worried about that kind of stuff, you can start focusing on improving the environment, right?
Yep,
and I think that
absolutely.
that's the point. So you see, and you really actually, you don't just see this here in America. You've seen this basically all over the world, where whenever you have an increase in wealth, eventually you reach a point where people start to prioritize other things besides those basic necessities. And once they do that, the environment tends to get better, because guess what? People don't want to live in a smog-filled environment. They don't want to live in a place where their kids are sick from poor air quality, and so they don't want that. And I actually think you could argue that the very fact that you have the Democratic Party out there trying to make this a core campaign issue, not air quality per se, but just all sorts of environmental issues, is proof of the fact that that we are so wealthy that we can now start to worry about things that are not basic necessities.
Right.
These are not primary concerns for people in the early 1900s and in the late 1800s, when people were just, you had intense urbanization, you had the Industrial Revolution, you had people just trying to get jobs, and millions and millions of immigrants coming to America with nothing at all. They didn't care about the environment. They were too busy worrying about their own personal lives. Now they can do that. It's a luxury to care about the environment. That's the point.
Well,
I think that makes sense.
I would think that, like, your kind of average person on the left listening to you guys say this would be like, oh, no. This isn't because of some wealth thing and everything just starts magically getting better. This is a result of government regulation and getting more into the weeds when it comes to protecting the environment. I mentioned the EPA. That's where they're going to say all of these good trend lines are coming from. So how do you respond to that?
So that definitely had a role, right? When we're looking at the Clean Air Act, there were things that were done that, regulations that were enacted that were effective, and they did spur the power plants, for example, to become more clean. But when you look at environmental regulation in, say, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? Like, they have laws that say you can't wash the ore in a river. They have laws that say you can't use children in your cobalt mines. But nobody listens to them because there is not enough economic opportunity for those people in other sectors of the economy. So if you have a situation where people are, trying to just live, right? Subsistence mining, subsistence farming, you can have whatever regulations you want on the books, but they won't have any teeth because people will ignore them if it is a rational thing for them to do. So like when Justin was talking about it, it's absolutely true. Like, people will make the short-term rational decision that makes the most sense for them at the time. And as you become more wealthy, the decision starts to turn from, do I need to do this in order to live, to how can I improve my standard of living? And that is where the environmental regulations start to have teeth, because you have a public sentiment behind it.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So the whole notion that the government stepped in and saved us from environmental disaster misses the point that the public is the one driving the government to create the regulations in the first place. In other words, the people wanted it. So government was reacting initially to people caring about this problem. And why did they care about the problem? Because they were wealthy enough to care about the problem. So that's all well and good. The problem with what the Democrats want to do is that at some point, they are increasing regulations by so much that they're now decreasing people's wealth. And by doing that, you run the risk of going back in the opposite direction again.
That's right. Show the curve, Andy. Show the curve.
All right. Yeah. So I knew you're going to jump in.
I teed him up perfectly.
So Isaac, you just talked about the Kuznets curve.
Yep.
This one you want to talk about. I think you're going to name it the Orr curve. Oh, yep. You already got it. So take us through this one.
If anything, I'm very humble. So I've just been thinking about this idea for the last couple of days. And, we do a really good job as libertarians, as conservatives, as free market people of talking about why our ideas are better for the economy. But we don't always do a good job of talking about why these are better for the environment, too. So this is the Orr curve. It is a graph very similar to the Kuznets curve, right? So you have environmental degradation on the y-axis, but you have environmental regulation on the x-axis. So up to a point, you have improved, or like a dramatically improving environment as these environmental regulations are enacted. But as Justin was saying, as soon as you start to reduce the standard of living, the GDP or whatever like that, for a society, the environment starts to worsen. So I would argue that California is seeing this. I mean, they've used their environmental regulations as an excuse not to build more housing. And then you have an affordable housing crisis where people can't get homes. You have an explosion in the homeless population. And that in and of itself is a public health hazard. So when you're looking at the ways that people have used and abused, frankly, environmental regulations to stifle economic growth, there are negative consequences of that. And I would argue that that leads to a net, well, I guess not a net degradation of the environment, but it starts to go backwards. You start to go into the Wayback Machine.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I guess that catapults us into your second piece here, which is that in Soviet Russia, air pollutes you. So I guess this would be at the far extreme of your curve. And I guess for all those people, I should mention this, and Andy will probably be happy that I do. For all those people, because the majority of our listeners are listeners primarily, probably listen to us on SoundCloud or Spotify or iTunes or something like that. We also are live on YouTube. So if you want to see our beautiful faces and you want to see these awesome charts that Isaac clearly just sketched on a notepad 5 minutes ago, tune into our YouTube channel, Heartland Institute. But yeah, so let's get into the second part. We were talking about how terrible the centrally controlled USSR is. So there's a bunch of stats in here, and I don't know if you want to read off any of them in particular, but it says here that the USSR, the country produced roughly the same volume of air pollution as the United States, despite its lower economic output. And so I was looking through here because you have in this kind of pull quote area, it suggests that the USSR at its height was between 1/4 and 1/2 the size of the US economy at its height. And I do want to mention that is like a major kind of source of debate.
Interesting.
The CIA originally, during again kind of like the year prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, they estimated that the size of the Soviet economy was 65% that of the United States, and like growing faster than the United States. However, Yuri Meltsov, who was a defector from the Soviet Union, he reported that the true numbers, because all of this is obscured because it's obviously a very non-transparent regime. He said,
really?
yeah,
No,
right.
Sorry, go ahead.
He said that the real number was actually closer to 4 or 5% of the United States.
Wow.
Yeah. So then after the fall, they did some studies and stuff like that as well as they could, and found that it was maybe closer to 1/4 or whatever. But yeah, even that. So 1/4, let's just say it was 25% that of the United States, but they're producing more pollution than the United States.
Yeah.
It's pretty bizarre stuff. So was there any other interesting findings you had when you were putting this one together?
But it's not that the Soviet Union didn't have environmental regulations. They did. But the desire for people to follow those regulations was much lower than it was here in the United States. And that's primarily because people were having a hard time getting by in the Soviet Union. So if you really want to have, so I read this really interesting book. It's called Sapiens, and it just kind of goes through the history of humanity from like, the earliest phases like Australopithecus and other like evolutionary ancestors of humans. And as you're going through, dang, I got sidetracked trying to remember Australopithecus. But man, what was I? It'll come back to me. Don't worry.
Terrible.
One thing I wanted to say.
No. Let's
Isaac
stop
no.
Let's stop and really point out and make his face
laugh
turn
at
red.
him.
All right, fine. Go
Point
ahead.
and laugh.
Yeah.
I think that what Isaac is saying is actually perfectly illustrated with poverty and crime. This is actually something that we see all the time. Everybody intuitively understands this with poverty and crime. When there's more poverty, there's more crime. Even though there are all sorts of laws saying don't steal stuff, don't shoot people, don't. In many of these places, they have more laws. You can't. There's all sorts of laws that are broken all the time in these major cities. And why is that? The laws exist. There's lots of police officers. It's because when people are poor, they don't care what the laws are. In many
They have less to lose.
They have less to lose, right? Because their situation is already bad.
Yep.
So poverty is driving the crime. So really, this is no different than that. If you have wholesale industries, you have people who are desperate to keep their jobs, you have an economy that is struggling, and they just want to keep their jobs. They just want things to keep moving forward. They are less likely to care, what the parts per million of some particular pollutant is coming from their factory. They're less likely to blow the whistle on that. They're less likely for people to report it because because they're desperate to keep that factory open or whatever.
That's a great way to portray it. Yeah.
I actually wrote that down, and I hate to give Justin credit for anything, but that was great.
Unfollow him on Twitter, folks. All right, Isaac, I will give you one last opportunity to get your Australopithecus
let's move
point
on.
across. All right, all right. Do you want to mention anything about your part 3 or potential part 4?
So I stole part 4 from Matt Ridley, so that was fun. He's very smart. He's the rational optimist. So I guess we could maybe talk about part 3, but it's not that big a deal. So basically, I'll just summarize part 3 a little bit. In case you guys didn't know, Venezuela not doing super great right now. And one of the ways that this regime is trying to bolster itself is obviously through the sale of oil. We've all known that. But another way that they're trying to do it is they're trying to sell mineral rights in a part of the Venezuelan rainforest. And it's not good, right? So there's no real protections. It's basically like military operations going around this place called the Mining Arc, and they're just running these like very environmentally friendly mines. And they're just said, like, don't freak out because there's a lot of guns around here. So basically, the people who are working in these mines are treated terribly. I mean, they work long hours, they get very little pay, and it's basically they're working at the end of a gun. So the environment is also being destroyed. And I would argue that a big reason that we are looking for minerals, is because we don't mine enough in the United States. So that's been one of my themes with our big mining project here in Minnesota. Minnesota has the world's largest undeveloped deposits of copper and nickel. And we also have the largest deposits in the country of cobalt. So when environmental groups in Minnesota say that we don't want to mine here because we think it's bad for the environment, what they're doing is it's like prohibition, right? So we all know that prohibition did not stop people from wanting to drink. So people decided that they were going to get it somewhere else. So that all that did was it took it from a more regulated, more transparent place, and it sent it to areas of the economy in the United States. But what's happening for mining is it's going to countries that have fewer protections for workers in the environment. So it's not a global good to say that we are not going to be mining here. And it's actually really irresponsible because we have the capability to do this in the most environmentally responsible way out of pretty much anybody in the world. So we're really kind of abdicating our responsibility to reduce the amount of pollution globally. So it's really, I think, an irresponsible way to look at this. It's saying, like, I would rather build a fence and kick, the so it, like, just as an example.
Good analogy.
I was trying to be delicate, but screw you.
I'm cutting you off. Justin, 5 minutes. You have a kind of an alternate kind of pathway to all of this idea of capitalism, kind of the solutions that we have, or the systems that we have for energy or whatever, are actually better than the ones being proposed on the left. Got 5 minutes, sir.
You want me to talk about it for 5 minutes?
Yeah, just go.
No, that's your limit. I don't. You could stop
Oh,
short of
great.
that. That's fine.
Great.
But I'm putting you an outer limit.
Yeah,
right.
we're muting you at 5, Justin.
Yeah. All right. So my whole this goes back to everything that Isaac's just been talking about, and actually the Venezuela point is a great example. It's illustrative of what happened in the Soviet Union, which Isaac was also talking about before. It's the same idea. If the government is taking care of you, if the government's primary responsibility is to take care of you, then that means that if things are not going well for the government, then the government has to become increasingly more desperate to make sure that they figure out a way to repair that problem. So what you have in Venezuela is a desperate government that's saying we have to find ways to make money. We have to get resources that we can sell overseas. And so what are they doing? They don't care about the standards anymore. The government doesn't care about the standards. Why? Because the government is the one tasked with taking care of you. And if the government isn't doing that, then it's not going to remain in power for much longer. So it is desperately trying to find a way to do it. So they're the ones dismissing the environmental regulations that they probably also have in the books in Venezuela. It probably exists there. They just don't care because they are more concerned about staying in power. So again, the same sort of self-interest that Isaac was talking about before, I think is great, is illustrated there. Going back to what Donnie was saying, trying to tee me up for this, and I'll have to keep it very short, but my belief is that if you look at what's going on with the left right now, you have people running around the country telling us that we absolutely have to eliminate fossil fuels because fossil fuels are going to destroy the planet. They're going to destroy the planet. We're all going to die because of fossil fuels. That you're going to have millions of people displaced. That you're going to have thousands, tens of thousands of people even dead as a result of higher global temperatures in 80 years. That all these things are going to happen because we're using fossil fuels and primarily that we're destroying the environment. We are completely destroying the planet. And so we have to enact these green energy sources. They call them green energy, right? Everyone just accepted this term, green. They're green energy, wind and solar especially. Now, what do they mean by green? When they say it's green, do they mean it's good for the environment? No, they obviously don't mean that. Because what would be great for the environment is for humans to just go live in a hut, right? That would be the best thing for the environment. No power. If humans didn't exist, that would probably be better for the environment, right? So the left knows this. So when they say green, they mean better for the environment than existing conventional energy sources. That's what they mean. The problem with that, though, is that when you say better for the environment and you're calling for wind and solar, which require substantially more land than conventional energy sources, really what you're saying is I want to destroy the planet in order to save it. In order to run the country on wind and solar, you need a landmass the size of the state of California at minimum, just in the United States. And the United States is only like 12% of the world's CO2 emissions. All right. So if you were to do that all around the world, think about how many hundreds of millions of acres of land, how many hundreds of millions of animals, how many hundreds of millions of animal habitat, et cetera, would have to be destroyed in order to run the country on wind and solar, because wind and solar they require a massive amount of land. And that doesn't include, by the way, all of the transmission lines that you would need to build across all of these different parts of the world that currently don't have any transmission lines. The reason why humans have chosen the conventional energy sources they've chosen, the reason why these things exist is because they are not land intensive. That's the whole point. They don't take up a whole lot of land, and yet they're able to produce massive amounts of power from a relatively small amount of land and for relatively little cost. That's the whole point. And so the market has already sort of worked this out. Now, the market could do a better job of working this out if there weren't so many regulations and there weren't so much cronyism that exists in that industry and everything else. But the reality is that so-called green energy sources are actually really bad for the planet. They are not good for the planet. And that doesn't include all of the other stuff, like how do you recycle wind, like wind turbines and things like that? What do you do when they stop working? What do you do with the toxins that can come from solar panels and that sort of stuff after they stop being used? What do you do with all of these different things? You have to find a way to dispose of them. You can't just throw them out on the lawn or something like that. It's going to seep into the groundwater. So you have all kinds of environmental problems, tons of environmental problems related to so-called green energy sources. And the idea that we can solve them by just destroying the planet, it doesn't make any sense. We're better off with what we have right now.
Wow, you almost nailed it on the dot. 5 minutes.
That was great.
That was good. Obviously, all of your experience on Tucker Carlson and stuff like that has made you more concise. You know, it's working. It's great.
Wow,
Thank
I
you,
never thought
Donald.
that would work. Good work, Jackie.
One thing
I would like to add to that,
All
if
right,
I can.
fine,
I'll keep it under 30 seconds.
fine.
But the fact that you can't rely on wind and solar to provide electricity when you need it is so crazy, because you have to have both. You have to have the wind and solar and the backup. It's like mandating that everyone have a normal car that runs on gasoline and a Tesla, and pretending that requiring this whole other Tesla doesn't have any negative environmental impacts.
Good input.
Totally.
All right, so moving on. I've got a couple of other things that are actually kind of supplementary to this, and one of them kind of goes off of your kind of second article there about the Soviet Union. So what I have in front of me is an article from the Foundation of Economic Education. This is a piece titled "Why Socialism Causes Pollution." It is authored by Thomas DiLorenzo, who is a professor of economics at Loyola University. That could be outdated. I'm not entirely sure. And I know that he works at, or at least works extensively with, the Mises Institute. So this is a great article that basically is just a laundry list of different socialist governments and their horrible track record when it comes to environment. I am not going to be able to get through all of these because it's several pages long, but I do want to hit some highlights. Of course, everything that we talk about on the show will be linked in the show notes. But it starts off with the same premise that your article started off, Isaac, which is basically the idea that capitalism is supposedly incompatible with environmental protection, and the idea that the profit motive is the primary cause of pollution, and all these things that you kind of tirelessly hear all the time. So it starts off and it says that in the Soviet Union, there was a vast body of environmental law and regulation that purportedly protected the public interest, but these constraints have had no perceivable benefit. The Soviet Union, like all socialist countries, suffered from a massive tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons, similar to the idea of unintended consequences, should be a term that is in your holster. That is something that constantly comes up, especially when you're talking about socialism. Where property is communally or governmentally owned and treated as a free resource, resources will inevitably be overused with little regard to future consequences. So again, then it goes through a whole bunch of examples specific to the Soviet Union, but I'm just going to read off this one here. Typical example of the environmental damage caused by the Soviet economic system is the exploitation of the Black Sea. To comply with the 5-year plans for housing and building construction, gravel, sand, and trees around the beaches were used for decades as construction materials. Because there is no private property, no value is attached to the gravel along the seashores. Since, in effect, if it is free, the contractors haul it away. The practice caused massive beach erosion, which reduced the Black Sea coast by 50% between 1920 and 1960. Eventually, hotels, hospitals, and of all things, a military sanitarium collapsed into the sea as the shoreline gave way. Frequent landslides, many 300 per year, have been reported. So then it just goes, again, example after example of just these rivers and waterways that are just completely just used as just like landfills, basically, for pollution, just dumped in there with no regard to what the real environmental costs would be. There's a couple of other ones, but for the sake of time, I'll skip over that. China says, in China, as in Russia, putting the government in charge of resource allocation has not been led to desirable environmental consequences. Information on the state of China's environment is not encouraging. According to the World Watch Institute, more than 90% of the trees in the pine forests in China's certain province have died because of air pollution. In the Chongqing, the biggest city in southwest China, a 4,500-acre forest has been reduced in half. Acid rain has reportedly caused massive crop losses, etc., etc. It goes into how Central and Eastern Europe, how they've fared way worse than their Western counterparts under the different socialist regimes and stuff like that. And it just goes on and on and on and on. But basically, the big takeaway here is that socialism has a horrible track record when it comes to environmental protection. One other one that I want to get through here, and then I have a kind of an open question to you both, is an article from the PERC, which is the Property and Environment Research Center. I think they are out of Montana. They're a great group. We use a lot of their material. This is an article called "Socialism is Bad for the Environment." So it kind of goes through the same type of things, the incompatibility, the profit motive, blah, 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 blah. It says that socialist economist Robert Heilbronner admitted that central planning has failed economically, but he basically says that the ecological burden of economic growth that's being placed on the environment is something that we actually have to worry about. Yeah, economics is secondary, right? So it goes through some examples. It says, by one estimate, in the late 1980s, particulate air pollution was 13 times higher per unit of GDP in Central and Eastern Europe than it was in Western Europe. Levels of gaseous air pollution were twice as high as this, and wastewater pollution was 3 times higher than this. It says in East Germany, 60% of the population suffered from respiratory ailments. Conditions were so bad that Heilbronner acknowledged the Soviet Union became the first industrialized country in history to experience a prolonged peacetime decline in average life expectancy. Like, these are human-caused humanity crises, and all under the name of trying to be better for the workers and fairness and all of the stuff that they try to push socialism with. It says, as the Iron Curtain lifted, socialism's dirty environmental secret was exposed. Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were the most polluted and degraded places on Earth. He basically equates this. There was a term that was coined called ecocide, which was pretty interesting.
Interesting.
It says one explanation for the disparity is that the central planners, unlike markets, grossly misallocate resources as a matter of routine. Energy prices, for example, were highly subsidized in the socialist economies of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. As a result, industrial production was far more energy intensive throughout the socialist world than it was in Western Europe economies. 5 to 10 times higher, according to one estimate, leading to more pollution. The 1992 World Bank study found that more than half of the air pollution in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe could be attributed to subsidized energy pricing during this period. So, I mean, that makes perfect sense. So these industries or whatever, if they're getting like really cheap energy because it's being subsidized, then why would you have to reduce the amount of energy that you're using? There's no price signals. So you can just use as much energy as you want. It's being subsidized. So yeah, right. 5 to 10 times leading to more pollution. This is central planning directly leading to environmental disaster, basically.
Well, that's exactly what Venezuela was doing. They were subsidizing the price of gasoline for their citizens in order to keep them from revolting. And then now that fracking has put so much oil on the market that oil prices are down, and their petroleum industry has been so mismanaged, believe it or not, that now they don't have that. They can't pacify the people anymore. So totally agree.
Yeah, here's another example. Socialist planners, on the other hand, lack the knowledge necessary to rationally coordinate economic activity. In their 1989 book, The Turning Point, Soviet economists Nikolai Smelev and Vladimir Popov offered an illustrative example. To bolster the production of gloves, the Soviet government more than doubled the price it paid for moleskin. Warehouses soon filled with mole pelts, but glove makers were unable to use them all, so many of them rotted. So it's just like central planning is a disaster. There was another example. I forgot where I read this, but it was out of the Soviet Union, and it was like these factories were given quotas on the amount of nails, the amount of nails that they were supposed to produce. But like the quotas were done in like weight. Like you need to produce X tons of nails. So the factory, taking the path of least resistance, just decided to make slightly bigger nails. They weighed more. They were able to get to that quota faster. But then what resulted in the country was a shortage in nails. It's insane stuff, man.
At the core of all of this is this idea that the left has that capitalists only care about money. So therefore, they'll do anything to earn a dollar, including pollute your river and do all this terrible stuff to you, right? Like that they believe that. But then the flip side of that is they believe in this like benevolent bureaucracy where you have this group of people that go into government and they will properly manage all of these things because I guess they care, not because their jobs are necessarily on the line, but because they just care a lot about the environment. And so somehow you have to believe that humans are utterly incapable to be a socialist. You have to believe that humans are totally, utterly incapable of doing the right thing on their own. Right? That just if you give them freedom and you give them power in the market and you give them power to control their own businesses, they're not going to do the right thing. They're going to do bad things to people. But those same people, when put in a bureaucracy somewhere, in some Capitol building with a protected job and, no incentive to do the right thing at all, just voluntarily choose to do the right thing. And it doesn't make any sense logically. Why would I trust the bureaucrat, the totally disinterested bureaucrat who lives 1,000 miles away from me, who isn't really even an expert in my particular field? Why would I trust that person to manage the environment in Kansas?
Well,
but I won't trust the farmer in Kansas because he's a greedy capitalist. Like that's the argument that they're making, though.
Well, okay, so Justin and I, obviously we're doing the Stopping Socialism project, and one of the things that we have found to be an invaluable source of information is actually reading their literature, right? So you and I are both in the middle of a Socialist Manifesto, which starts off pretty good, and then it's
super boring.
Super boring, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, like Stopping Socialism?
So anyways,
just ignore him.
So one of the things that I like to think about, because the way that they talk is obviously like in very idealistic circumstances. They talk about these things in their ideal forms and basically not taking into account other factors and stuff like that. So the concept of getting away from the profit motive and to not be wage slaves and to open up people's lives so that they could spend more time appreciating art and stuff like that. Like, when it comes down to it, when it's actually in practice and we see the closest example, like the Soviet Union, like all of those examples are like because the Soviet Union was struggling so much to outproduce and do better than their United States counterparts. And it's like, I feel like the only way that their idealized vision of what socialism could be would only work if every country was playing into this. Otherwise they're going to be left in the dust economically, right?
Yeah, but even that falls on its face because what great Soviet rock bands from the 1970s do you still remember?
I think that's a great point. I think that we actually have this experiment already exists in the United States. We already have a massive welfare state in the United States, and a large segment of that welfare state, not all of it, but a large segment of it are just people who don't want to work. It depends on the state that you live in, and it depends on all sorts of different factors and the laws in those states and whatever the work requirements they have and everything else. But there is a welfare state there's a welfare state in many parts of this country with large populations of people who simply just don't feel like working. And are these people like actually the artistic geniuses of society? Are these the bastions of culture and harmony and peace? Because these people don't have to worry about working. They're not wage slaves. This person who's living off of welfare payments and food stamps and stuff like that, they could work. They choose not to. Why aren't they the ones producing all of this great artwork? Why aren't they the ones who are the ultra educated intelligentsia of society? Why are those people not the ones producing all? Because obviously that's not how it works. I mean, clearly providing people with just all of this, we're just going to take care of you and you're not going to have to be incentivized to do anything. Those people do not go on to produce. In fact, most of the time they are the ones, that's where crime is highest. That's where we have most of our social problems. That's where we have pollution. That's where we have all of these issues. It's in intense urban areas where you have lots of poverty and large welfare states. It's because people are motivated by their own self-interest. And when you take away that self-interest from people, when you take it away from them and you give them no reason to better their own lives. Because in the case of the welfare state, it's especially bad because you actually punish people who are trying to improve their lives by taking benefits away from them the more they work, right? So you have created an environment where you're punishing people from becoming more educated, from getting better jobs, from improving their lives by taking benefits away from them. You're killing any opportunity for them to do the very things that they're claiming will happen if all of us just live off of the welfare state. And then they're assuming that the bureaucrats who are going to be put in charge of these massive industries are going to be able to manage them perfectly and do all of these things with no personal incentive of their own other than they're just a good-hearted people. Have you been to the DMV or have you been to these places?
I have to go. My license is expiring.
I went to the DMV. Now, the DMV is not terrible everywhere, but the DMV in Chicago is by far the worst experience at a DMV I have ever had, ever in my life. I was there for like 3 hours. There were, I kid you not, I counted. There were at least 9 different stations that you had to go to, each with their own set of employees. One guy, I'll never forget this for as long as I lived, looked like he was ready to die at any moment. He was probably 90 years old.
He's probably wishing for it.
His only job was to stamp a receipt that you got from the previous station. So you pay the money at the previous station, you get a receipt, he stamps it. That was it. That's all he did was verified your receipt. I mean, it was a joke.
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, that is, we have to get to our last topic here, but that is kind of illustrative of how the central planners would have our society set up. And I think Ed Hudgens, I don't know if he actually said this on the podcast or when we were talking afterwards, but in his time in the Soviet Union, he saw like where you'd go to a store and you'd have to go to a counter to place your order. Then you'd have to go to another counter to pay for your order. Then you'd have to go to another counter to pick up your order. The DMV applies to everything.
I know we're running out of time, but I recently, when I was getting into a debate with someone who leans very much in this direction, Bernie Sanders type voter, and I brought up the fact that government is wildly inefficient. And I brought up all these examples of how the government has wasted money, roads, projects, all these different things. In New England, the Big Dig is like the classic example of a gigantic government project that was a total disaster. And everybody here knows it, right? And I brought that up. And his response to me was, well, yeah, okay, maybe it was wildly inefficient, but where did all that money go that the government spent on this project, this extra money? It went to the workers, and the workers then went out into society and they spent the money. And so it's like the entire liberalism is built on the broken window fallacy, where we can just run around breaking windows, and it will be good for the economy, because that means we get to hire all sorts of people that can go around repairing windows and making windows. In total, that might be fine for those individual people, but the total economy never improves. It's wildly inefficient.
So speaking of Bernie Sanders, we got to get to this last topic because I already made the title screen for this episode, so we have to talk about it. This is an article I got from the Reason Foundation. It is titled "Bernie Sanders Gets a Lesson in What a $15 Minimum Wage Would Mean." So it starts off and it kind of talks about how apparently workers are upset with their employer, Bernie Sanders, the workers of his campaign, because they did the math. And they found out that their salary that they are getting does not equate to $15 an hour. It's actually less than that. So they, Justin, I think you were on Tucker Carlson talking about this recently. So maybe you can take us through, because I think this article is a little outdated.
Yeah, this is maybe the best story of the year. I've been saying that to when I've been doing media appearances about that. I really believe this might be the best story of the year. You have Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders runs around the country, says we have to have a living wage. He's made the minimum wage, $15 an hour, a moral issue. It's not just good for the economy, good for workers. You have to give it to them, because if not, you're exploiting workers. While he's doing that, he is actually, according to his own logic, exploiting his own workers. So his workers for months are working and complaining that they're working sick. Their lowest rung workers in his campaign are working 60 hours a week at $30-something thousand a year, which amounts to like $13 an hour. So they're complaining that they're working too many hours and they're making less than a living wage. So they go to management, right? They're unionized. This is incredible. They're a unionized group of employees working for a socialist presidential campaign. They go to the socialist presidential candidate and they demand higher wages. And the socialist presidential candidate responds by saying, okay, after a lot of complaining, okay, we will give you higher wages, but only if we cut your healthcare benefits.
Oh, wow.
We're going to cut your healthcare benefits. Before they were providing 100%. They wanted to cut them down to like 80-something% or something like that. So think about this. This guy is telling us this is a human right. Healthcare is a human right. So now he's exploiting his workers, his unionized workers. They complain and say, this isn't fair. We deserve a living wage. They respond by saying, okay, we'll give you your living wage, but only if we take away a fundamental human right. That's how this whole thing played out. So finally, the union rejects that offer. They reject it. This is going on for months. They get really angry and they go to the press. And they leak all of this to the press, right?
So this is very disappointed in that.
Right? His own workers, his own campaign is going to the press, leaking this, including the emails to the press. The press gets it. They run with it. And now Bernie Sanders is demanding that nobody in the campaign talk to the press. So he's trying to silence their speech.
That's how real socialism works.
Yeah, he's exploiting his own workers, then taking away their human rights, and now he's silencing their free speech. So this all gets out, and they say, "I know this is amazing, right?" So then, they win the PR battle. They cave, and they give them a raise, and they reduce their hours, and that's how they get to their what amounts to basically $16 an hour if you're working every week. Okay, so $16 an hour. So then while that's happening, like literally the same day, like within a day, another socialist, Rashida Tlaib, who's part of the squad, okay? She's like a less famous Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if you don't know who she is, okay? She comes out and she says, you know what? $16 an hour, that's not going to cut it. We need a $20 minimum wage. So according to Rashida Tlaib, a Democratic socialist, Bernie Sanders is still exploiting his own workers. That's what's happening here. This is wonderful. So good. This is so good. And in her logic, she said, you know what? $15 an hour, that was great when we started this whole thing, but $20 an hour, that's what, because the price of eggs and milk and all of this stuff, she literally used that as examples. It's all going up. So we have to raise it now to $20 an hour. And it's like, when does it, we haven't even gotten to, it's still $7 and something cents an hour. So they're talking about tripling the minimum wage now, tripling it. And I mean, this is the CBO recently came out with a report that showed that if you just moved to $15 an hour and you did it incrementally, by 2025, you had the actual $15 an hour. It would increase wages for the people who had jobs, but it would reduce jobs for low-wage workers by 1.3 million people. 1.3 million people. There'd be 1.3 million fewer jobs, and as many as, that could be as high as 3.7 million jobs could be gone. And that was if we incrementally did it by 2025. At Rashida Tlaib's pace, the minimum wage will be $5,000 by 2025.
Dude, I'm for that. Now that I can benefit, let's do it.
Be careful what you wish for, because with hyperinflation,
you'll
after
only
the
be
Green
able
New
to buy
Deal and modern monetary theory, you might be earning $5,000 an hour. That will buy you the number 5 spot in the bread line.
Oh yeah.
Andy, take note. We have to section out that last 5 minutes and make it its own video, because that is some fantastic stuff. All right, we are already running long, so let's wrap this up, ladies and gentlemen. Any last words of wisdom, jokes, anecdotes, anything you want to say before we sign off for the week? All right, fantastic.
Isaac. Go ahead, Isaac. I know you have some snide remark to make, like you do every week.
No, everyone have a great weekend.
Oh, how nice. How nice. All right. Thank you, audience, for tuning in to this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Please tune in every week for a new episode every Friday. If you like our show, please subscribe, write a review for us on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. You could also find us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, pretty much everything nowadays. You could also find us on YouTube if you want to watch us. If you would like, you can follow us on Twitter at In The Tank Pod. If you want to send us a comment, suggestion, question, anecdote, whatever you would like, feel free to email us at inthethankpodcast@gmail.com. Justin, where can the people find you?
On Twitter and Facebook at Justin T. Haskins. And update, we have now surpassed 17,000 followers on Twitter, so we are growing substantially. The unfollow Justin movement is basically dead.
You know what to do.
Well done, everyone.
No, don't even bother muting him.
Isaac,
he's right. I'm defeated.
Where can the people find you?
In a dumpster.
You're throwing in the towel? You're throwing in the towel?
In a dumpster someplace. Like Justin won. Life's not worth living.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.